You pull into the gas station you've used for years. Same drive, same routine. Only this time the pumps are taped off. A handwritten sign says it's closed for good. No explanation, no warning, just gone. So you drive farther, then farther again. The price is higher, the line is longer, and suddenly a simple errand feels different, heavier, and that's when it hits you. This isn't about a bad day or a single station shutting down. Something bigger is happening all at once. Decisions were made somewhere far above your head, and now you are the one adjusting your life around them. Across California, drivers are hitting a breaking point. Not loudly at first, but steadily, mile after mile, closure after closure. What began as inconvenience is turning into anger, and anger into pushback. Hundreds of stations are disappearing, choices are shrinking. And the people who rely on their cars every day are starting to ask hard questions. Because when the basics begin to vanish, this isn't just a California problem anymore. Welcome to Tax Hack Pro. Today, we are diving deep into the quiet crisis unfolding at the pumps, a crisis that threatens to redefine mobility, cost, and control for millions of Americans. The breaking point that sparked the drivers' revolt. No one revolts because gas costs a few dollars more, and no one pushes back just because they have to drive a few extra miles. If that were all, people would complain, shake their heads, and move on. But what is happening in California isn't a small adjustment. It is the feeling that familiar pieces of everyday life are being quietly pulled away, little by little, right in front of you. At first, people try to reassure themselves. One gas station closes. Fine, you will just drive 10 minutes farther to the next one. But then that station closes too. Then another one puts up a sign that says permanently closed. Suddenly, you are rethinking your route every morning. You are watching the fuel gauge more closely. You are timing when to fill up. You are waiting longer in line and paying more. And the first question that pops into your head isn't, why is gas more expensive? But why is this happening to me? You start noticing things you never used to think about. The numbers on the pump, the price sign from across the street, whether it is worth stopping here or pushing your luck to save a few cents somewhere else. These are small decisions on their own, but when you are making them every day, they leave a strange feeling behind. Life starts to feel tighter, more constrained, even though you haven't done anything wrong. What really gets under people's skin isn't the extra money. It is the constant adjustment. Just when you adapt to one change, another one shows up. No warning, no clear explanation. You just wake up and realize that from today on, things work differently, and it is on you to figure it out. A lot of drivers start noticing this feeling in very ordinary moments, standing in a longer line than usual, looking around and seeing the same tired expressions on other faces. Hearing someone ahead of you mention that the station near their house shut down last week, too. No one is yelling, no one is picking a fight, but the air feels heavier than it used to. Over time, it stops feeling like isolated incidents. When the same story keeps repeating in different neighborhoods with different people, it starts to look like part of something bigger. And once that picture becomes clear enough, the thoughts people used to keep to themselves start coming out more often. If this station is gone today, what is next tomorrow? If everything keeps shrinking like this, how many more adjustments am I supposed to make? And why do changes that affect daily life so deeply keep happening without anyone asking the people who live with the consequences? Not everyone says those questions out loud, but a lot of people are thinking the same things at the same time, and when that happens, the mood shifts. Before, people were willing to accept it because they believed it was temporary. But when gas station closures stop feeling like exceptions and start feeling normal, that belief starts to crack. Patience doesn't disappear overnight. It wears down slowly, every time you are forced to stretch a little more. For younger drivers, it is frustrating. For older Americans living on fixed incomes, it is something heavier. They don't have much room to experiment. Every small change hits their budget, their health, their sense of security. When things that stayed stable for decades suddenly feel uncertain, anxiety doesn't need to be explained. It shows up on its own. Eventually, a lot of people reach the same invisible line. Not a line of explosive anger, but a line of endurance. When you start feeling like you are always the one adjusting, always the one giving up ground, always the one expected to accept less, the question shifts. It is no longer, how much longer can I handle this? It becomes, why am I always the one who has to? From that moment on, attitudes change quietly, not dramatically, but for real. People start paying closer attention. They start connecting the dots, and they realize this uneasy feeling isn't just happening to them. That is when something begins to form beneath the surface. Not a movement with a name, but a shared state of mind, less acceptance. More skepticism, more willingness to question what is being decided on their behalf. And when enough people reach that point together, silence doesn't hold the way it used to. That is where many drivers in California find themselves today, not because they want to cause trouble, but because a long series of small, repeated changes has finally touched something deeper than inconvenience. It touched the question of whether they still have control over the routines that shape their everyday lives. Hundreds of gas stations are being forced to shut down. At first, it sounds hard to believe. Gas stations don't just vanish. Not in a place where nearly everyone depends on a car to get through the day. Not in a state as large and spread out as California, and definitely not hundreds of them at the same time. Yet that is exactly what drivers are running into. Often without warning, often out of habit, pulling into a familiar lot only to find tape across the pumps and the lights shut off for good. What makes this moment unsettling isn't just the number of closures, it is the reason behind them. These stations aren't shutting down because people stopped buying gas. They aren't failing businesses pushed out by lack of demand. They are being forced to close because a regulatory deadline has arrived, and for many small, independent owners, the cost of meeting it is simply out of reach. Upgrading underground fuel tanks can run close to $2 million per station, a figure that might be manageable for national chains, but is devastating for family-run operations that have survived for decades on narrow margins. For years, owners were told there was time. The rules were on the books, the deadline was far off, and assistance programs were supposed to help cover the cost. On paper, it all sounded reasonable. But in reality, permits dragged on, contractors were hard to secure, and loan applications sat unanswered for months, sometimes years. Some owners did exactly what they were asked to do. They filled out the forms. They waited for approval. And while they waited, the clock kept ticking. By the time the deadline finally came into view, there was no room left to maneuver. Stations that had served their communities for 30 or 40 years were suddenly out of options. Not because they wanted to close, but because staying open meant fines they couldn't survive. So the signs went up, permanently closed. No ceremony, just an empty lot where a routine once existed. For drivers, the details of that process don't matter much when they are staring at a locked pump. What they feel instead is the immediate impact. The station they relied on is gone. The next one is farther away. The one after that is busier, more expensive, and already stretched thin. A quick stop turns into a detour. A detour turns into a daily adjustment. And those adjustments start stacking up faster than people expected. Nearly 500 stations across the state are tied to this same situation. That is not a handful of bad luck stories. That is entire regions losing access at the same time. And these closures aren't evenly spread. Many of them are in rural towns, agricultural areas, and working-class neighborhoods where there isn't a station on every corner. In some places, losing one station means losing the only one for miles. Think about what that does to daily life. Every commute gets longer. Every errand costs more. Every decision about when to leave the house starts revolving around fuel. For people already watching their budgets closely, especially retirees and workers on fixed incomes, those extra miles aren't just inconvenient, they are stressful. They force choices people don't have to make. What is pushing tension higher is the speed of it all. These closures aren't unfolding slowly, giving communities time to adjust. They are piling up within months. Drivers barely get used to one change before another hits. One closed station becomes two. Two become a pattern. And once it feels like a pattern, the mood changes. You can feel it at the stations that are still open. The lines are longer. Conversations drift toward the same topic. Someone mentions the station that closed near their house. Someone else says they had to drive twice as far last week. No one is yelling. No one is panicking. But there is an edge to it now, a sense that something basic is slipping. And once people start noticing that, the questions follow naturally. If this many stations can disappear this fast, how many more are next? What happens when fire season hits, or when supply gets tight, or when demand spikes? And if access to something as fundamental as fuel can shrink this quickly, what other parts of daily life are more fragile than they seem? Who pays the price when small stations disappear? When a small gas station shuts down, there is no siren, no emergency alert, no red banner flashing across a screen. It happens quietly, and that quiet is what makes it dangerous. Because for the people who live nearby, the cost doesn't show up in the headlines. It shows up the very next day, and it is anything but small. This isn't the kind of hit that large corporations feel. They have capital, they have systems. They can pass costs along. One station closing is just a line in a report, but for the people who stop there every day, it is a piece of daily life being pulled away. A nurse finishing a midnight shift. A tradesman heading to a job site before sunrise. A retiree relying on an older car to stay independent. For them, a gas station isn't just a business location. It is part of how their life works. Losing a gas station isn't like losing a convenience store. It changes how you move, how you plan, how you live. A 5-minute stop turns into a 20-minute detour. the cheapest station in the area disappears. And every fill-up costs more. The stations that remain are packed, lines stretch longer, tension shows on people's faces, and slowly people start leaving the house with a new question in the back of their mind. Do I have enough gas to get everything done today? Small, independent stations play a role most people never notice while they are still there. They create choice. They keep prices from being pushed too high. They operate in places the big chains don't bother with. When they disappear, what is lost isn't just a pump. It is a layer of protection for the community. No backup options, no margin for error. And when choice disappears, pressure lands squarely on drivers. The remaining stations become mandatory stops. Prices rise even without a fuel shortage. Costs climb without a declared crisis. For people living paycheck to paycheck or on fixed incomes, a few extra dollars per fill-up isn't trivial. It adds up. It eats into grocery money, medication, basic necessities. Older Americans feel this first and feel it hardest. They live farther from city centers. They drive older vehicles. They have less room to adapt. Switching to an electric car isn't realistic. Moving closer to services isn't an option. When the nearest station closes, their circle of independence shrinks. Every trip becomes a decision. Every outing becomes a calculation. Some losses don't show up on a receipt. The constant low-level anxiety, watching the fuel gauge more closely than before, the quiet worry about what happens if something urgent comes up. If there is an emergency, if help is suddenly farther away, these worries don't announce themselves, but they linger. Why is everything hitting at the same time? There is a moment a lot of drivers are having right now, usually while sitting in traffic or waiting in a longer line at the pump. When the thought creeps in, why does it feel like everything is getting harder all at once? Not one problem, not one bad week, just a steady pileup of things that used to be manageable now arriving together. Think about how this actually shows up in real life. The station you used as a backup is gone. The next closest one is busier than it used to be. Prices are higher, but not because of some big breaking news that morning. Nothing dramatic happened overnight, and yet somehow the system feels tighter, less forgiving, like there is no slack left. For a long time, these pressures stayed in the background. Rules were written, deadlines were set, upgrades were discussed. But they felt far away. People assumed changes would come slowly, one piece at a time. You would adjust, then move on. That is how it usually works. Except this time, the waiting dragged on and the adjustments never really happened. Now the waiting is over and everything is landing at once. Stations aren't disappearing one by one over the years. They are shutting down within the same stretch of time. At the same time, fuel supply is tighter. Remaining stations are stretched thinner and demand hasn't dropped. People are still driving to work, to appointments, to take care of family. The need didn't go away. The room to maneuver did. You feel it in small ways before you ever put words to it. The hesitation before deciding whether to run one more errand. The quick mental math when the gauge dips lower than expected. The irritation when a quick stop turns into a half-hour detour. None of these moments are dramatic on their own, but together they change how a day feels. What makes this especially frustrating is the timing. If these changes had been spread out, people might have absorbed them. 1 year higher prices, another year fewer stations, another year tighter supply. But when those things stack on top of each other, patience wears thin. Not because people are unreasonable, but because they are being asked to adapt faster than their lives allow. From behind the wheel, it doesn't feel like a transition towards something better. It feels like being squeezed from multiple sides at once. Pay more, drive farther, plan tighter, make fewer mistakes, and do it all without much warning while the margin for error keeps shrinking. That is when the questions start getting sharper. Was anyone looking at how these changes would overlap? Did anyone consider what happens when several manageable problems hit at the same time? Or was the assumption always that drivers would just figure it out, because figuring it out only works when there is room left to do so? When every small adjustment costs more time, more money, more energy, something shifts. People stop assuming this is temporary. They stop believing the next change will be easier, and they start paying attention in a different way. Why will this hit you even if you don't live in California? It is easy to hear what is happening in California and think that is their problem. Different states, different politics, different rules. But the people who are feeling the pressure right now didn't think this would be their problem either. A few years ago, most California drivers would have said the same thing. And that is what makes this moment worth paying attention to, even if you are hundreds or thousands of miles away. Because what is unfolding here isn't just about one state losing gas stations. It is about how a strain inside a large system doesn't stay contained. It leaks, it travels. And by the time it reaches you, it rarely looks like the same problem anymore. Start with something simple. California doesn't operate in isolation. It is one of the largest fuel markets in the country, and neighboring states depend on it more than most people realize. Arizona gets roughly a third of its gasoline from California. Nevada depends on California for the vast majority of its supply, and in places like Reno, that dependence is almost total. When fuel access tightens in California, those ripples don't stop at the border. They show up as price jumps, supply squeezes, and sudden volatility elsewhere. But you don't need to live in Arizona or Nevada to feel it. Fuel is woven into everything. When it becomes more expensive or less predictable in one major region, transportation costs rise, delivery routes get longer, shipping gets pricier. Those costs don't disappear. They get passed along quietly, folded into grocery prices, service fees, and everyday expenses. You don't see a sign that says California gas station closures surcharge. You just notice that things cost more than they used to, and no one can quite explain why. What is happening now also exposes something deeper: how fragile normal really is. Most drivers don't think about fuel infrastructure until it starts failing. They assume there will always be another station down the road, another option, another workaround. That assumption holds until it doesn't, and once it breaks in one place, it becomes easier for it to break elsewhere. We have seen this pattern before: one refinery fire, one pipeline disruption, one port slowdown. Prices spike far beyond the immediate area, not because everyone suddenly needs more fuel, but because the system has less room to absorb shocks. California is already operating close to that edge. When hundreds of stations disappear at the same time, that margin shrinks even further. Ask yourself this: if a single state can lose access points quickly without a declared emergency, what does that say about the resilience of the system as a whole? And then there is the human side of it. The drivers pushing back in California aren't doing so because they enjoy conflict. They are reacting to the same pressure that exists everywhere. Rising costs, fewer choices, and the feeling that everyday life is being restructured without their input. That combination isn't unique to California. It is familiar to anyone who has watched their budget tighten while being told to adjust. That is why this matters beyond geography. When people see others reach a breaking point over things they recognize, commutes, fuel costs, basic mobility, it resonates. It plants a question. If it happened there, why couldn't it happen here? And in many ways, it already is. Maybe not through gas stations yet, but through insurance, utilities, housing, healthcare. Systems get tighter, options disappear, costs rise, people adapt until they can't. California just happens to be where that pressure is surfacing first and most visibly. There is also a timing issue that shouldn't be ignored. This is happening as refineries shut down, as supply chains remain fragile, and as global energy markets stay tense. California already imports a significant share of its fuel, often from overseas. Any disruption, geopolitical conflict, shipping delays, trade restrictions, adds another layer of risk. When one of the largest state markets becomes more dependent on imports, the entire national supply picture becomes more exposed. None of this means there is an immediate collapse coming everywhere, but it does mean the warning signs aren't abstract anymore. They are concrete. They are playing out in daily routines, longer drives, higher prices, and rising frustration. So even if you don't live in California, this story isn't distant. It is a preview of what happens when multiple pressures line up and there is no buffer left. It is about how quickly manageable problems stop being manageable. And it is about how ordinary people, pushed far enough by small, repeated changes, eventually start asking bigger questions. The question now isn't whether this stays contained. It is how many places will feel it next, and whether anyone is actually prepared for that answer. What is happening right now isn't just a story about gas stations or fuel prices. It is about how small, seemingly manageable changes can quietly make everyday life feel more unstable, more constrained, and harder to predict. When the basics start breaking down in one place, they rarely stay contained. If you drive every day, live on a fixed income, or simply want to understand what is shaping the cost and stability of daily life, keep following Tax Hack Pro. Like the video and subscribe to the channel so you're not caught off guard by changes that move slowly at first, but become very hard to reverse once they arrive. Thanks so much for sticking with us to the very end. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a like and subscribe so you don't miss any of the daily updates. And now feel free to check out some of our latest and most popular videos shown on your screen. Goodbye and see you in the next one.